conversations for Dr. Farhan. It's a pleasure to host you as well and also to hear from your journey, from the work you've been doing, and also see how do we shape the future of the industry, the pharma industry that is, but also the healthcare landscape and healthcare ecosystem in Africa. Because at the end of the day, somebody has to put in the work and somebody has to make the difference in terms of driving growth that we are hoping for. So as we get into the conversation, maybe take this opportunity to let us know who is Farhan, what does Farhan do, and what are his interests so that our viewers can also get to know you.
Okay, thank you so much, David. So, I think this is firstly a great initiative. I am a true believer in people learning from other people's experiences and being able to grow through them. As an individual, we can't experience everything in life holistically. So it always helps when we can hear other people's experiences and be able to learn from that. So, great initiative, and thank you for having me. So, as introduced, my name is Farhan Yusuf. I'm a pharmacist. I am from Tanzania. I live in Tanzania currently. I studied here. A lot of that is because of my passion for Tanzania as a country and Africa as a continent. Love my country, love Africa and the potential that it has. I have been working mostly in the development NGO sector for the last 11 years now. And before that, I did some work in community pharmacy immediately after graduating. And the areas that I have been working in primarily, I started off my career in the NGO world with doing pharmaceutical supply chain related work. I did that for a few years. Did some work also in like other components of health systems such as governance. And over the last, I would say 6, 7 years, I've been focusing more on public-private partnership for health, which is, an area that I am now quite passionate about and happy to talk about that a little bit more later. And of course, I think throughout that journey, I've also been sort of dealing with issues around digital health, which I think is also something that is changing the landscape around health quite a bit, especially more recently. In terms of interests, I like traveling, I like, talking to people, I like talking in general, and just, sharing ideas, communicating with people. As I said, I really enjoy learning from others. Yeah, that would be me in a few words.
Fantastic. It's a pleasure to know that as well. And I see your passion for traveling in your pictures whenever they come alive. So I get to know that you really travel and you enjoy, you're living your passion, which is amazing. So for me, and maybe I would start the conversation from your professional practice in the different spaces that you've mentioned. From graduation, you went into community pharmacy, then you went into the private sector, mostly development world, supply chain, now public-private partnerships and all that. As a convention, then the question that I would ask is, how did you make the move from community pharmacy into the development world? And the reason for that is most of our pharmacists, when you're getting out of school, we are fixated on three areas of work: community, clinical pharmacy, or industry. And that is the convention of what we think of. So how did you make that move and what are the opportunities that you see in that space?
Thank you, David. So I think for me, I have always been the kind of person who likes doing things that are slightly unconventional. I don't, as much as I learn from people, I don't like taking the path that a lot of people take, which is quite interesting because I think, what I have seen within our ecosystem is a lot of people tend to do the opposite, like they crowd the areas where everyone is because for them, they are like, that is where the opportunities are, that is why everyone is in that particular space. For me, it's always been the opposite. I think about where is the opportunity in what other people are not doing and how you sort of carve a niche for yourself out of that. So from the time I started like my bachelor of pharmacy degree here in Tanzania, I never like community pharmacy. I don't think was ever something that I saw myself do for a very long period of time, even though that is the popular notion that if you study pharmacy, you'll either end up owning a pharmacy or working in a pharmacy, not even so much, hospital, etc. But And so till today, there are some people who are like, we don't understand what you do. It's clearly not pharmacy. So then I have to take time in explaining them how what I'm doing is pharmacy. And actually, one of the reasons why I even picked pharmacy as a career was because I felt like there was a lot of variety in it, in the sense that there was the science part of it, but then there's the entrepreneurship part of it. There's the, even the science part is either hospital or industrial. So I found that quite interesting when I was making a choice for the career early in my days. And so when I actually started studying, I was highly inspired by the cartoon Dexter's Lab. I don't know if you remember that, but and so I had a very strong interest for industrial pharmacy at that point of time. When I started off my journey, I was like, okay, I want to do industrial pharmacy. And that's how I progressed. I think it was up until third year of studying my degree is where two things happened. Number one, I attended this talk by, an industrial pharmacist, someone who had been working on developing malaria, a malaria medicine. And I remember him saying that it took him 13 years to develop that medicine. And I was like, okay, I don't think I have that much patience as a person, right? Like I need to sort of see the results of what I'm doing almost immediately. So that was like the first X on my industrial pharmacy idea. And then later on in that year, I went and did some field work, which was mandated at that point of time by the university, to an industrial pharmacy to see actually the, manufacturing experience and all that. And being in that experience, I realized, okay, again here I will be interacting more with machines and all those rules around good manufacturing practices, etc. And wear this, not that. I felt it was too constricting of an environment for me, because I like being out in the open, I like interacting with people. And so, after that I was like, okay, so clearly industrial is also, out of
Scopes.
options. So I
Mm.
was basically eliminating. I was like, okay, community is gone, industrial is gone. Then I think I shifted more towards hospital pharmacy, because I also loved pharmacology as a subject and I did well in it. But
Mm.
then very quickly I realized that at least at that point of time, I think the ecosystem, especially in Tanzania, was not very strong when it came to hospital pharmacies, right? Like I think
Mm.
hospital pharmacy, especially on the African continent, has progressed very slowly and is still progressing. I think pharmacists are still sort of trying to figure out their space in that ecosystem, because many
Mm.
of our countries are very, medical doctor centric, like everything revolves around the doctors. And so there's this struggle in developing a healthcare team, right? Where
Mm.
everyone is playing a certain role. So I was like, okay, I might go into hospital pharmacy, but then, it's as good as being a community pharmacist within a hospital, right? You're
Yeah.
not actually doing hospital pharmacy.
Mm.
And so I was like, okay, clearly I need to think a little bit more, but then I was already close to graduation. So post graduation and post internship, I did, I was like, okay, since there are no other options, let me just do community pharmacy while I figure out. So that is why for like 1 or 2 years, I ended up doing community pharmacy.
Mm.
How I landed, and at that point of time, I didn't even know that there's this whole, like NGO/development world. And I think that's one of the challenges that we still have. I think many pharmacists are either not aware or they don't understand the nuances of it, etc. And so, they don't really enter in that space. But how I came across that space was that I was talking to a friend of mine, and he apparently was already hired by an international NGO doing some supply chain work in Tanzania. And again, talking to him and realizing what he's doing, I was like, okay, that sounds like something I would
Interesting.
want to do,
Mm.
right? It sounds interesting. It has a lot of like interaction with people, capacity building, etc. You're thinking about health system and figuring out supply chains. I was like, okay, that sounds interesting. And then when that organization sort of advertised for certain positions, I applied, I got in, and from there is where I sort of continued in that journey.
Fantastic, fantastic. And I think looking at your story, then one key thing that I think I love about it is we are not going to get out of the market already having figured out where we want to go. But it's about exploring and taking those chances because probably you'd be like, 2 years I've been in community pharmacy, it's normal. Let me just continue with it. Becomes a comfortable zone for you. But it's also the aspect of being open to learn and see what new dynamics are coming into that space and all that. So at the current moment, when you look at it with your work with in the development world and all that, what does it entail? If somebody asks, Farhan, what does development world pharmacy practice look like?
So firstly, something that you are talking about, David, I think when I saw career guidance is again something that I'm very passionate about, especially because I know that that is something that is highly missing in many of our countries within the education system, and it's quite unfortunate because I feel a lot of young people end up making decisions about careers without having any form of guidance, which is quite a challenge. And I always talk about that. But whenever I'm talking to young people about, career choices, etc., I tell them that I think in today's time and age, the most important characteristic that you need to have as a young professional is that of adaptability, right? Like you need to be able to adapt to the things around you because we live in a world of the fourth industrial revolution with things changing very quickly, etc. I know you've spoken about things like artificial intelligence, all these emerging technologies. We no longer live in a world where you can, just be rigid and be like, okay, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, because there are possibilities that what you are doing now may not even be relevant in like the next 5 years, right? So, what I tell young people is that just be adaptable, right? See what the opportunities are, see where the tide is going and all of that, and see how you can sort of, go with that tide. And so that is something, based on what you were saying earlier. As far as the development world is concerned, I mean, it's a lot of these international, either NGOs or consulting firms, etc., that work on, largely donor funded projects that can either be, your country government donors, such as USAID, such as FCDO, which is the UK government, and many others, or it could be, for example, funded by some private sector, a foundation, etc. And it's project based work, so you're working on certain projects or programs that are fairly, time bound, and then you have certain, that project is trying to solve a particular, I would say, health system challenge. So either it's a supply chain related, or it's related to human resources for health, or it's related to digital health, and you're working very closely with like country governments and like country counterparts, right? So you're basically, sort of the implementer and the middleman between, the donors and the recipients, who are, either the governments or, citizens, etc. And so it's interesting because as I mentioned, I think for me the important thing is that you're constantly learning, you're constantly sort of keeping up with new approaches, new interventions. For a lot of these things, you are constantly communicating with people, you are constantly helping build systems that have a long term, sort of effect. Now, on one thing that we always talk about in this particular space is that you need to have a lot of patience, and you need to sort of focus on small wins, because big wins can be difficult to achieve. They are few and far between, and so it's not like the commercial sector where you sell something and you see profit and you see, here you a lot of the especially health systems work is very much related to you laying foundations that will have fruits like 5, 6, 7 years down the line. So you need to have that patience in terms of, seeing the results of what you do. But then of course there's also, I think, more service delivery work especially depending on what health area you are working in. So for example, in health areas like HIV, there's a lot of like service delivery work as well, where you are actually again providing certain products and services to the people or playing. Hello?
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Yeah. So you are, either providing the products and services yourself, or you are working with stakeholders to make sure you get those products and services to them, which again tends to be a bit more like quick rewarding because you see what you're doing. So it's a very sort of nuanced area, and I think we can have a separate, webinar just on how this world works, because
Mm.
it's a very different space. And I think there's also a lot of like misconceptions that young people have about, for those who know about this world. There's misconceptions around, oh, every as long whenever you enter the NGO development space,
Mm.
everyone will pay you a lot, and like, so there's these like misconceptions that also need to be cleared. But either we'll have the time here, or maybe we can have a future conversation about that.
Interesting. Thank you so much for that, Farhan. Actually, I think you're becoming clever because I was to ask you how many dollars do you get to receive? Because I've been told development world there's a lot of money, and I was also about to ask maybe you give me a role in the development world to make the much money. But it is understandable. There is the work that comes with it, but also the understanding of what key value are you delivering, and that is something that people need to understand and need to be open to. So, growing on that experience in the development world, what would your typical day look like? Because I see there's a lot of stakeholder engagement, a lot of programming. And when you look at talking of 5 to 10 years for the project, actually the fruits of the work you put in to come to materialize, then it means you have to be a visionary. Because if you lay a framework that can only get us for the next 2 years, then it means in the next 7 years, when we expect the fruits, it will already have been overtaken by the times and circumstances. So, what would a typical day for Farhan look like in your work space?
So a typical day for me, and again, this might be, different for different people, even within the development space, right? But I think a typical day for me involves, reading a lot and like finding out, what's happening in the development world, either related to the area that I'm working in, or just generally within like global health, right? Because a lot of these things are very much related, and especially I think now the thinking is very much about how do you link climate change to health and things like that. So I think, my typical day involves a lot of reading, and how well guarded the health sector is. And so there's always new guidelines, new procedures, new SOPs that you sort of need to keep up with. It's extremely important because again, that allows you to provide value, right? The more you know about what's happening around the world, the more well versed you are, the easier, well, not easier, but like the more you can suggest novel interventions as well. It involves, as you mentioned, yes, a lot of stakeholder engagement, because in this world we work very closely with our public sector counterparts. For me, because I have been in the public private partnership space, it's also interesting because not only do I focus on the public sector professionals, I also focus on the private sector and try to figure out, okay, how do we bring these people together and make them work. A typical day also includes a lot of like planning, because you're supposed to have like work plans, because you have donor funding. You're very much accountable to that, and you have to make sure that you are delivering on what you're supposed to deliver on. So there's work plans, there's a lot of reporting, because like a big chunk or a big part of this world is knowledge creation and knowledge sharing, right? Which is, I think, slightly different from the commercial sector, for example, where you're not really, in fact, you're maybe even not sharing everything that you are doing, because it's like corporate secrets and stuff like that. But in the NGO world, almost everything that we do is a public good, so we are supposed to put it out there. We are supposed to share our experiences with other organizations, with our counterparts in the country, within the public sector, with the general citizen. So there's a lot of report writing, report reading. There's depending on, again, what level you are at. There might be a lot of field work as well. So traveling for actually implementation. So going into, because, a lot of the intention of this development world is serving those who are not being served. So, there's a lot of implementation that is done in, the most underserved areas, whether it is rural areas, peri-urban areas, or there might be a lot of traveling for that. Then, as I said, because there's a lot of knowledge creation and knowledge sharing, there's also traveling for, like, attending meetings, workshops, conferences, etc. Because the idea is to share the work that you're doing so that other people can learn from it and you can partner with them. Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of a summary of it. Happy to answer other questions.
Fantastic. That's amazing. And some of the key bits that I would want to pick from that is, I think most people, when we talk about the NGO world, we think it's about the traveling. When you take good pictures wherever you are, we see the traveling and we get excited about it. There's a lot of reading, and that is something that I love that you've mentioned. The aspect on documentation, we don't like rewriting even a single article, but you want to be working in the NGO world where we can't document anything. And the key currency in a knowledge economy is having the knowledge, packaging it right for its use. And those are key things that I think most of our young professionals need to understand. But now, as we change gears a little bit, as a pharmacist, you've been in the pharmacy space from community pharmacy all the journey to the development world where you're currently engaging and supporting works. The question is, what are the trends that you see in the industry? And what opportunities do you see that young professionals, young pharmacists can take advantage of? And what would that look like for the industry in Africa?
Thank you, David. I mean, I will answer this and sort of relate to a question that you asked earlier, right? In terms of, like, how important it is to be a visionary, especially in this particular field. And I think a lot of that comes from this, again, aspect of, like, continuous learning and knowledge creation and knowledge sharing, etc. Because, as I mentioned, the world right now is changing so quickly, and there's so many, like, newer interventions that are coming up that are being implemented in different parts of the world, etc. So when you are crafting, a vision for any aspect of the health sector, etc., you need to sort of make sure you are aware of what is happening in other places, what is the good that we are be able to pick from that. You also need to understand things like government priorities for your particular country or the context that you are working in, and you need to, the best kind of vision is one that is co-created, and so you're bringing together and working along with all of these different stakeholders. But then, one important aspect, which is also somehow part of my day, is monitoring and evaluation and constantly being agile, right? Like, you may have a work plan, you may have a vision, but then periodically you're assessing and you're like, okay, this is how much work we've done. Has it given us the kind of, results that we need? What do we need to tweak and change, etc., so that we can either achieve the same vision or think about, do we need to change that vision as well, right? There's a lot
Yeah.
of, like, theory of change thinking as well, which is a term that some people might have heard of. And I think so, because of that, I think, when you're doing all of this, you sort of, and if you have that learning attitude, you sort of see, as I mentioned, the tide, the directions that, things are going in. I mean, post COVID-19, I feel like the health sector has started getting a lot more attention because, we realize that without health, everything can sort of shut down. Of course, we also have challenges with forgetting. I think we are forgetting, but then there's also a lot of conversation happening in health. So it's good. I wish there would be more, of course, always, but I think it's definitely changed post COVID-19, right? And
Mhm.
some bigger changes are coming there on their way. And so there's a lot of opportunity in the health sector, right? When you look at things like, and I'll speak more so from an African context, right? Like, I was recently at the Africa CDC last week for some of the work that they are doing. And I think, just use this platform to also give a message that I think young people on the African continent, especially those in the health sector, need to know what Africa CDC is, what it is pushing for, the kind of work that it is doing. Because I think when you follow the trend of the areas that Africa CDC as an agency is sort of focusing on, you realize, okay, this is where the opportunities are, this is where more work needs to be done, right? Like, for example, one big agenda is domestic manufacturing of health products on the African continent, right? Which we also realize post COVID-19 that we need to strengthen that within the African continent. Otherwise, we are going to miss out. And I think that's probably the biggest opportunity for pharmacists, right? Because when it comes to whether it is pharmaceuticals, whether it is, vaccines, maybe not so much in diagnostics, I feel that's more an opportunity for our lab personnel. But there's a lot of conversation. There's, I think, Africa CDC says that in order, just for vaccines, in order for us to be able to go from, I think, 1% of vaccines that we are producing to like 40%, I think, by 2050, we are going to need, I don't know how many thousands of personnel to be able to do that. And that's just for vaccines, right? We are not even talking about other health products, etc. And so that in itself is a huge opportunity, I think, that especially pharmacists need to be aware of, need to think about, etc., and need to get involved in. This will also come with regulatory issues, and I know you are very passionate about that. There's going to be the Africa Medicines Agency that in itself will be, I think, another great opportunity for a lot of pharmaceutical personnel to get involved. We are talking about things like pandemic preparedness. We are talking about digital health and everything that's happening with emerging technologies and artificial intelligence and machine learning, and how that is going to change the landscape. And I do understand that that is, again, a whole other conversation on its own. People have different perceptions about that. A lot of people fear that it might replace them, or, but I tend to be more positive about that, and be like, there will always be ways that we can use technologies to improve what we do, while also providing the value that we need to provide, right? So for me, I'm like, I'm hopeful about all these things. I'm constantly trying to understand. Another, rising opportunity is like climate health, and like how that relates to each other, which means that as a healthcare professional, you might also have to think about what those environmental aspects are, what those climate aspects are. And so I think it's a great time to be a health professional, especially from this perspective of, like, health system strengthening and development, and like supporting health systems, because we are in many ways refining a lot of the health systems on the continent, especially based on the learnings that we had post COVID-19.
Thank you for that. I think some of the key bits we've talked about, getting to know what agencies are in the continent and what priorities they've set. Because their priorities then set the investment needs, and that is where the opportunities are coming in. And I think most of our African, especially as young professionals, we need to understand what is the Africa CDC agenda. Because when we look at that, then we're able to know what are the priorities that we need to be focusing on. And then I love the other bit that you've mentioned around digital technologies, the advancements and these trends. Unfortunately, I have a reservation, and I think maybe you'd give us your perspective, but this gives me the next question as well. We realize that most of our conversations and most of the intervention that people are bringing in would be more on technologies from what is already in place. But the reality is technologies are coming from other sectors. You look at fintech, you look at the banking sector adopting these technologies and all that. The legal system, like for now, you're being told ChatGPT can review a legal case and give you judgments on what would be based on the previous proceedings and all that. How do we then get our young healthcare professionals and healthcare pharmacists basically to contextualize advances from these technologies from other sectors and put them into the healthcare space? Because that is where the opportunities will come in my perspective.
Thank you, David. Like I said, that is an ongoing, very interesting conversation. And you have the skeptics, you have those who are, overly starry-eyed about it and think that it's I think, for me, the first step really is for young people to first understand what these emerging technologies are, right? Because as long as you don't understand how something works, it's very easy for you to, either be too excited about it or too afraid of it, etc., right? Like, I'll tell you personally, I've been doing work in digital health. I'm quite passionate about digital health, but then I don't have a coding bone in my body. Like, I have tried, and so I don't understand these things from the tech side of it. But I do try to understand a lot about them from the application side of it, right? And as healthcare professionals, I mean, if you're able to learn these skills and sort of put them in your arsenal, great, because a lot of people will tell you that the next sort of step that's going to happen is that the world is going to be divided into those who know at least about AI and those who don't, right? Before we even think about whether or not, before you think about you competing with AI, think about you competing with people who know about AI versus you who doesn't, right? So I would say that is really the first step that health professionals need to think about. What is it that I can learn about what's happening with AI, right? What kind of capacity can I build? When you think about AI, do I have the interest in like becoming more of a coder, or am I more interested in like governance and policy issues, etc., and how can that be put into place, especially with some of the changes that are coming in. And of course this comes with the role of our universities, our educational institutions, our associations, etc. What are they doing to build the capacity of the pharmaceutical personnel as far as these technologies are concerned? So for me, I think that is step number one. Like, we need to understand what this technology is and then sort of bring it together with the health sector experience that we already have to try and see what kind of changes can it bring, and then practically like find ways to test these things out and all of that. Because you see, the thing is, the health sector will always be unique, right? Like, it may learn from fintech and from agri-tech and stuff like that, but the nuances are very different. And this is something that I also talk a lot about with young entrepreneurs, because I think what happens is that people think they see all this innovation happening in the other sectors, and then they are like, hey, why don't we do this within the health sector as well? But I'm like, you know, you have to understand it's very different. Like, I remember there was a conversation about someone thinking about 3D printing like some body organs. And I was like, you realize that's not the same as 3D printing a table or a, like, there are clinical trials and all of that. Like, you can't just 3D print something and put it inside someone's body, right? There's a whole process behind that. But then young entrepreneurs think about it from a point of view, oh, 3D printing, great technology, let's start building things. And so the that is something that I think people need to keep in mind, that the health sector will always be very specific, very nuanced, rightfully so, very guarded, because you're dealing with people's lives, which is a bit different from other sectors. Of course, all sectors are dealing with our lives in one way or another, but the health sector has a bigger contribution to that. So I think the important thing is for us as health professionals to first learn what all these emerging technologies are, and then try to see, okay, based on the experience that we have, how do we contextualize that within the health sector?
Thank you for that. And I think the way you positioned it is actually the right approach to it, because in the healthcare sector, we are dealing with human lives directly. If I do a wrong surgical procedure on you, I'm impacting you immediately. For an engineer building a house, maybe they'll mess the house and the house will now actually crash with me. It is indirect impact. And therefore, that has to be critical. And also, one of the approach that I'm just thinking of at the moment is we have a siloed approach to doing things, which definitely needs to change. Because if I'm interested in regulation, but I don't look at how the practical nuances around clinical practice are, the entrepreneur will think of developing 3D printing of a heart. But after the 3D printed heart is available, it cannot be used because it has not met the regulatory requirements. Then the person who is doing the regulation does not understand the key needs the clinician or the doctor who is attending to the patient needs. I think that siloed approach needs to change. And then that what takes me to the next question is what you've mentioned around the role of professional associations, the role of universities. and how they can help us actually get to interface with these new emerging trends and dynamics in our markets. My question to you is, as Farhan, do you believe your undergraduate pharmacy education prepared you for these advances, or it has been through your personal initiative and also desire to learn more? And the next question linked to that would be, how then do we change the dynamics to ensure that the next generation of pharmacists and young professionals don't have to go through the long chain of having to explore and get new information? How do we improve education system, in other words?
See, I have a slightly different view about this, right? And I talk about it a lot at like different platforms, etc. Because I I I feel like blaming the education system has become sort of an easy way out for people to sort of shift responsibility. That
Yeah.
like if I am not able to do something, it is because my education system has not prepared me for it, right? I think this conversation was much more relevant like 20 years ago, or, because again, when we talk about technology, it's not just changing interventions but it's also changing our way of learning,
Mm.
right? And so what I usually tell young people is that it's good to think about the education system, but I think the challenge that education systems face globally, by the way, not just in our countries in Africa, is that they are bureaucratic systems, right? Like because they are, managed by a Ministry of Education and things like that, there's a lot of like discussion and political levels and bureaucracies that goes into actually modifying a curriculum.
Yes.
When you sort of put that right along the conversation around the fourth industrial revolution, the fifth industrial revolution, and how quickly things are changing, my argument usually is that a general conversation around education systems need to be how robust are education systems to incorporate the rate at which the world is changing right now, and that
Mm.
is not just in the health sector, that is in every sector,
Every sector.
right? And the interesting thing also is, which comes from the privilege of being able to travel to certain other countries, is that in Africa we feel like we are unhappy with the education system, our education system is not good, etc., etc. I have heard the same complaints in European countries, I have heard the same complaints in other countries. So that feeling of my education system is not providing me what I need is universal, if you ask me, right? And
Mm.
there are many reasons for that. One of it is how bureaucratic these systems need to be. And that is why I always talk about, I think for every, when I, and maybe this comes from my health systems, strengthening working background, but I think of everything as ecosystems, right? Like everything is an ecosystem with the role that each person has to play, whether you're talking about that at a facility level where people are providing services, whether it comes to a system level, everything is an ecosystem, and a lot of different players have a role to play.
Yes.
So when I think about capacity building in today's time and age, yes,
Mm.
the educational institutions, the universities definitely have a role to play. And the conversations around upgrading our curricula and all of that and our syllabuses, etc., that needs to happen for sure, right? But
Mm.
we know that by design, that's not going to be a quick decision.
Yes.
The second role is where I bring in, our professional associations, etc., because everything cannot be learned at university level, right? Like you can't say that a university will teach you everything. Like it's not physically possible.
Possible.
Already, especially in the health sector, people complain about how difficult it is, how much content there is, and stuff like that. Of course, there's a discussion around how much of that is relevant content versus irrelevant, and I'm sure there are various opinions about that, but there is a lot of content. So there is no way that your university will be able to teach you everything. The role of education for me is to open your mind and give you skills of learning rather
Mm.
than teaching you everything, right?
Mm.
And so some of these gaps can be filled by the professional associations, whereby, so for example, I'll put a plug here, some of the things that the African Pharmaceutical Network is doing, right? With like the course that you do on regulatory affairs, etc. There's a lot of other, associations that are doing this. I think the International Pharmaceutical Federation does a lot in that space as well. I think our professional associations, especially on the continent, need to step up a little bit and figure out, okay, what are these gaps within the knowledge of our healthcare professionals, and how can we as a professional association create that culture of continuous learning and be able to fill those gaps. But then there's also a third angle of responsibility, which is the individuals themselves, right? I'm like, in today's time and age, what is it that you can't learn on YouTube
Mm,
or that you can't learn online, right? Like back in when I was in university, I actually had to go and sit in a library and go through dusty books to find certain things because the internet was not, had not progressed that much. Although I'm not saying I was in uni in the 70s, but even when I was in uni, which was in the early 2000s, internet had not progressed the way it has progressed now. And so the way of learning was very different. But in today's time and age, what is it that you can't learn by yourself online, right? Like young people spend so much time on Twitter and on Instagram and on YouTube but they don't, I think, maximally utilize the opportunity that they have of learning.
mm,
Whatever gap you have in your knowledge, be able to identify it yourself, talk to professionals, again, read, and read not just for the sake of passing exams, but read for learning, right? Like read what's happening in the world, what direction is things going in, what do I need to capacitate myself with to be in that particular space, and then find avenues to be able to do that. Like that's something that I always urge. Of course, again, this is for those people who are already in urban centers, already in universities where they have an understanding of technology. I can't say the same for people who are in rural areas, etc., and we need to think about how we capacitate them as well.
mm.
But at least for the people who are in these urban centers, how can they use technology, etc., better to capacitate themselves and play their role within the ecosystem also.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think there's a question that you asked, if we expected the university to teach us everything, how long would that take, especially in the healthcare space where there's already a lot of content to be covered? I think maybe we will be in universities for our entire lifetimes. We'll never graduate. That is the reality of it. So I think that
which
is
is
a challenge.
already the case anyways, right? Like when you consider the amount of time people spend in university, and then people want to do masters and then PhD, already we are spending so
Our
much
entire
time
lifetimes in school.
within the education system anyways,
Yeah.
and still we feel like we are not learning what we are supposed to. So
Most likely, I think from a policy level, we need to see how do we make our education systems be more agile and be more responsive to dynamics and market trends. And this gets me to some of the key challenges that I think my argument around it is I agree with you. Individual responsibility has to be key. Professional associations have a role to do, and that is one of the key bits we're trying to do with African Pharmaceutical Network, and even through the Pharmaceutical Society of Kenya, Pharmaceutical Society of Tanzania. How do we do it better? But the last bit of it is we need to be able to influence the private sector markets to come in. The change in practice does not happen in classes. It does not happen in government offices, but it happens in the pharma companies, in the hospitals, in the community pharmacies where the action is happening. These stakeholders have to engage with the education system because ultimately they'll bear the burden of it. If David is incompetent as a regulatory affairs professional, it is my employer who will suffer the consequences, having to train me for 6 months or 1 year. So how then do they ensure that the training is transforming and actually adopting these new nuances as we are moving along that journey? And I'm hoping that is a conversation we'll be willing to take up as we move along as well. But then it takes me to my next question to you. You've been in leadership positions from the days universities and in all the spaces that you're in, but also to the career guidance, because even the insight that you're sharing is around guiding people in their career choices and how to position themselves. What are the key gaps that you're seeing in that space? And how do we ensure that young professionals are actually closing out on these gaps? Because if we still have those gaps, ultimately we'll never achieve our career aspirations and our goals as we hope for.
uh, thank you, David. I mean, I would say for me, a lot of how I am today and like the direction that my career journey has taken, I think has been because my personal belief is that it's very important to have balance, right?
Mm,
In terms of and in context of the question that you are asking, I think, and this is something I always push young professionals for, students for as well, whenever I engage with them, is that think about how you become a holistic, productive human being, right?
mm,
Like it's
mm,
not just about, because I think also that the notion around the health sector and the health sector training is that it's very difficult, it's very time consuming, you have to study all the time, you have to get the best grades, etc., etc. But then where is the time for you to learn all these other skills, right?
mm,
Because then you will come into the job market, yes, you have all A's and all A pluses, but then you have zero work experience, you have never taken up a leadership position, you have never been, and you also being in the market, that that is one thing that has also changed about the job market, right?
mm,
Like now people are looking for performers, people are looking for people, almost all rounders. Like how do you problem solve, how do you critically think, how do you lead, how do you work in teams? Like there's so many nuances and factors around even things like employment, etc., that it's not just about the grades, right? Like
mm,
it's
mm,
not just about your academic performance. Now this is something I feel that educational institutions need to understand, individuals need to understand themselves as well, that as you are a student and as you are in that sort of journey, how is it that you sort of get some of these skills that you are not necessarily getting from academics and from studying, but
mm,
then you need them when you get out into the job market, right? And
mm,
one exercise that I have done with a few people who I have mentored, etc., which again brings out the importance of mentorship, right? Like getting someone to mentor you, guide you, etc., someone who is basically in the field that you are aspiring to be in, or just someone from the pharmacy professional that you look up to, etc. There's definitely value in that to try and fill some of these gaps and for career guidance and to be able to understand. And so an exercise that I do with some people is that you know sit and think about your skill sets, because I
mhm,
think it starts with knowing yourself, right?
mm,
Like that is the most important thing. So almost do an audit of like what are the skill sets that I have, what are the skills that I don't have, and then sort of plan a trajectory of how you're going to get those skills. Because I think even things like participating in these student associations, which we have quite a few of in many of our educational institutions, the moment you get to university, your community service also needs to be targeted, right?
mm,
Not to say that your intention should not be to serve, people and to help people by all means, but you also need to think about what am I learning from this, or what skill set am I getting from
getting
this
from this.
particular process, right? And so I always tell young people that think about that, like think about what is it that you need to learn? Is it public speaking? Is it leadership? Is it time management? Is it coding? Is it, and then look for avenues on how you can fill those gaps within, while also making sure that you are managing your academics. I think it's very possible if you, again, just if you are thoughtful about it, if you time manage, if you have the right kind of guidance, I think you're able to do a lot of these things, if not all of them, right? The point is to constantly grow yourself, etc. The one other thing that I would really like to emphasize on is the importance of work experience. I think not many young people also realize that, like, while you are studying, whatever opportunity you get, whether it is during your holidays, whether, try to get as much work experience as possible, because that is what will also help you make the kinds of decisions. I mean, universities provide field work, which I think is great, and we need to figure out how to do more of that. In fact, I think in Tanzania, the university where I studied has over the years even increased the scope of this field work as well. When I was there, we used to do mostly community pharmacy, hospital pharmacy, and industrial pharmacy. Now the students do field work in regulatory authorities as well, in policy making. So it has progressed, and I think that is a great thing. I hope all educational systems sort of, apply that. But outside of that as well, even again, the individual students themselves, what can they do to get some of this work experience, etc., so that they are able to identify what these gaps are and then be able to fill them, with support from some of these other things.
Fantastic. And I think I love that bit that they've now gone beyond the conventional three that were there and opening up, including going to the regulatory authorities, to the policy side. It's amazing because now that is where you now shape the next generation of professionals who are going to take up responsibility and take up the work. And there's one thing that I love about what you've shared, and I think it also helps me in terms of thinking some of the approaches that I've been looking at. And the reason as to why we have the Footprints Project, you can only pursue what you know. So the awareness has to be there. And you can only be aware when you've had a story from somebody and experience from other people. And that is one way of me learning from you in looking at what you're doing in the development world, your practices. Then by that virtue, then we make it accessible to other people to learn. And hopefully then it is a personal initiative to make a move and say, can I try this out? Can I reach out to somebody who can help me make it better? So that is commendable, and I really appreciate your contributions and your support to the professional development of pharmacists and healthcare professionals basically across the continent. And I'm looking forward to more of that as we move along in this journey along. So my next question to you would be, as Farhan, what do you see as your trajectory of practice in the coming years? And what informs that?
David, I love the space that I am in, this whole, development world and all that. I think for me, it has always been the best of both worlds because I get to continuously learn and grow myself, etc. But then I'm also having like social impact, which is something that, not all can. I mean, of course, in health sector, I think all of us are impacting, people's lives in one way or the other, which is great. But I think, I get more sort of satisfaction from knowing that I'm playing a role within health systems and all of that and building things that can have long-term impact on the lives of people. So I, think about continuing to be in this space. Of course, I have thought about, or I continuously think about rather, what areas do I want to you know, sort of specialize in or get into, because I'm a person of a lot of varied interest, which also I want to tell people is not a bad thing, because I talk to a lot of young professionals who are like, but I'm interested in this and I'm interested in that and I'm interested in this. And that's not a bad thing. That's a great thing. You just need to sort of prioritize. And I think it helps to sort of create your niche in one area so that you are at least known for, that David, by the way, is great when it comes to regulatory affairs, right?
Mm.
He can do other things and nothing stops him from doing that, but at least you've carved out sort of a reputation and a niche for yourself within a particular area. I think that's important, but beyond that you can learn and you can, do a lot of different things. I am quite interested in some of these conversations that are happening on the African continent, so I am hugely passionate about everything related to pandemic preparedness post COVID-19. I think that's an area that we really need to put in a lot of work in. I am very interested in the conversations around domestic manufacturing on the African continent because, being a pharmacist and just thinking about it from a self-reliance point of view in Africa, I think that is something that I'm very interested about. And I'm very interested in these conversations around, emerging technologies, digital health, AI, and the potential of how that can change how we do practice within the health sector. So I would say I intend to continue being in this space, either as a as employed by some organization or even as a consultant on my own, but just being able to continue playing a role in this space in terms of health system strengthening and with these particular areas that I'm quite passionate about at this point of time.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you for that. So my last question to you would be, as somebody, a young pharmacist somewhere, a young professional somewhere is looking at Farhan and saying, Farhan has made it, he's a successful person, a successful professional. What is success to you? And what hack would you give such a person to be as successful as you in your line of practice?
Always an interesting thing, right? I think what I will start off by saying is what I mentioned earlier. Like, you need to know yourself, right? And everyone has to go through that process. And unfortunately, that is not something that we are taught within schools. That, in fact, I have even had conversations with some people in the education sector in my country and told them, like, that should be a course or something that is taught to people. Like, how do I know myself? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? What drives me as a person? It's very important to know all of those things. And within that is also your own definition of success, right? Like, success looks different to different people. And I hope people realize that, because I think, especially in today's time and age with social media and all that, there's this whole conversation around, we are constantly looking at people and being like, I want this person's life and I want that person's life. uh you know Everyone has their own story, everyone has their own journey, and even though we may think we know what someone's journey is, we don't really know, right? Unless there's opportunities like this where people truly are able to share. And so I think everyone needs to know themselves and then be able to define success for themselves. For me, I think, so I have like huge imposter syndrome, in the sense that, I'm constantly like, if you ask me, I don't know if I believe I'm successful. Like, what I know for Farhan is that I enjoy doing the work that I do, right? And like, that is very important for me as an individual. I enjoy through my work being able to interact with people, being able to learn, being able to impact things the way I mentioned, which is why I love working on the African continent, because I see the need, I see, the impact of what I'm doing. And so for me, I would say that is success. It's continuous learning and growing on a regular basis. I put a lot of value into that. I also value my interactions with people, the relationships I'm building. I value being considered a thought partner in this particular space. Like, it gives me a lot of joy for people to be like, hey, we're thinking about this, we would love to hear your thoughts on this. So I really enjoy that. uh at the risk of sounding, you know I don't personally gauge success in terms of traveling or the amount of money, etc. That's at the risk of sounding too good or something like that, but it's just in the spirit of honesty. It's how I think of it. I think if you grow yourself, if you provide value, opportunities will come looking for you. And that is, I wish more people thought like that, rather than them continuously chasing opportunities and losing out on self growth in the process.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for that. That's fantastic and it's amazing. It's about knowing what we want and what does success look like for us at a personal level. It's been a pleasure hosting you, and I really enjoyed the conversation. I've learned from you, and I'm hoping our viewers as well, when they're reviewing this, they'll be able to find it valuable and it will shape their career journeys as we move along. So thank you so much for being here and joining us, Farhan.
Thank you, David, for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.